Hey everyone, welcome back to Nova Conversations. I'm here with Rose Santana, and I can't wait for you to hear her story, hear her background, hear all the things. I am just really excited to finally get to talk to you. We tried to set it up last week, technical issues, and now we're here. So Rose, welcome. How are you?
I'm good. It's sunny down here in Florida. We haven't had a lot of rain, which is very confusing because it's rainy season. So now we're kind of just all like on edge, like when's the rain coming?
When's the next hurricane coming? Like it's like almost probably like you guys are preparing for something massive to hit.
Yeah, especially considering the fact that we haven't gotten anything this year so far, but a lot of places have had issues. So like a lot of places have had hurricanes, and we're all kind of just sitting here in South Florida like, are we next? Or are we good this year again?
Yeah. Last year, did you get a big hurricane? You're in Miami, right?
Yeah, we haven't gotten anything major in like the last 5-6 years.
Wow.
So, yeah, we've been very lucky. So now we're kind of just all sitting here like, is it almost time for us?
Yeah, it almost seems like the cards, the roll of the die has run out. That's weird. Like, because like, okay, I'm gonna do the peninsula with my hand of Florida, and so I know Jacksonville's gotten hit a few times, and then of course like New Orleans and up on the what's it called, the Gulf interior side of Florida has gotten
Panhandle.
The Panhandle, that's the word. Yes. So it must just keep going around Miami. Is that?
Yeah. Like the Keys got hit, I think 2 or 3 years ago, but we like it missed like everything outside of the Keys, like northern. So we're kind of just sitting here like, are we okay?
Wow. Tense. That seems very tense. So, okay, before I get into your background in history, I've been trying to remember to ask people what's their favorite field story. Like when you go out, do biology, when you're snorkeling or diving or doing whatever it is you do as a lovely biologist. Is it you want to share your story of like a funny story or just a really cool story, something interesting, something embarrassing, whatever you want? What's your favorite field story to share?
I mean, I've been in the field in every possible spectrum that you could be in the field. I've been in the field scuba diving, snorkeling. I've been just in the field setting up traps and setting up cameras. I've been on a giant boat. I've been on a helicopter that flew us out to an ice glacier. I mean,
Wow.
there's so many. It's so weird because you think marine science and you think everything is the same. And I was like, no, I mean, even my experiences have been vastly different. I mean, it's really, I'm terrified of snakes. So it's great that for a while I worked in mangroves and we had put out these traps to try to sort of get an idea for what the biodiversity looks like within these small mangrove communities. And there was a snake inside the trap and I saw it before I opened the trap. And I was very brave and I kind of just chucked the trap back into the mangrove and I was like, nope, that trap is lost forever. Nope, not doing it.
Not touching that one.
I was like, that one is just gone. And my field mate was just like, really? Did you just do that? I was like, yep, I did. Moving on.
You go to like the data entry part, you're like, oh, I don't know where trap 37 went.
I was like, it just disappeared. I have no clue. Like, that's field work, but it's fun because you always have like different scenarios. I mean, a lot of the times when I'll go out into the field and I'll do like snorkeling or diving surveys, there's always a whole bunch of people interested in what it is that we're doing. And I think that's the great part about science is giving people that aren't involved into it half an opportunity. A lot of times they will be interested in what you do. So it's just always fun to get out there and interact with people when I'm in the field.
That's really cool. And I want to circle back to that. But for right now, can you talk about your background, where you're from? I know you've traveled, well, you've moved all over. How did you end up in Miami? Your history.
I'm a mutt by every possible definition of the word. People always ask me, they're like, where are you from? I was like, well, how much time do you have? So I was born in Dominican Republic. My mother's Dominican and my father's German. I spent some time down here when I was younger, when I was around 8 or so. Then we moved to Germany. I spent a significant amount of time there. I graduated high school there and I got my first bachelor's degree in biotechnology in Germany. Then I moved back to Florida to pursue a degree in marine biology. And I've sort of kind of been here ever since, but I sort of sprinkled 10 countries or so around in my lifetime where I've lived. It's always interesting because I feel like every single country that I've been in, the one thing that it always had in common is just the ocean. And it sort of gave me a deeper appreciation for it. It's like things change, people change, cultures change, the landscape changes. But there's two things that are always certain: the sky and the ocean. I know that. So that's sort of it's been one of my main driving factors. I ended up at Florida International University in Miami. I did my degree in marine biology there, and now I'm starting my PhD there. And I'm going to be looking at coastal conservation stuff. But it's been sort of interesting because my sort of niche, it was a complete accident that I happened in here. I had once jokingly told, one of the TAs for one of my classes, like, hey, you should hire me to come take care of your fish because I have fish tanks at home. She's like, wait, are you serious? Because I'm looking for an assistant. I was like, well, yeah. And I actually stayed that day after class for an impromptu interview. And she's like, all right, you start Monday. And I was like, okay, then. Great.
Wow.
So it really was an accident, which is why I always tell people, put yourself out there, talk to people, ask for opportunities, because you never know, what's going to happen.
Yeah. And that doesn't sound like an accident. That is you being vulnerable and aggressive in the sense of like, this is what I want to do with my career and I'm going to make it happen. So that mindset, that manifestation, not accidental.
But it's funny because so she did ecotox work. So she looked at how copper affected fish swimming behavior.
So by ecotox, you mean ecotoxicology?
Yeah, ecotoxicology. So specifically aquatic toxicology. And I mean, it wasn't even something that was on my radar. I never thought about it before. It's something that I was interested in. And I was like, all right, I mean, I need experience in a lab. This is a way to get my foot through the door. It is what it is. And I ended up doing it and finding it so fascinating because to me, it was just super interesting to learn how what we as people put out into the environment is actually changing the way these animals are behaving in the environment and what that means for us in return. So it ended up being something that I was actually really, really interested in. And now something that I'm trying to weave into my graduate studies as well. So you never know what your passion is going to be. People are always like, well, I want to do this and I want to do that. I was like, until you get out there and you sort of dip your toes into everything, don't try to like pigeonhole yourself into one thing because you never know, what amazing thing you're going to see. And you're going to be like, oh, I think this is really cool. And I'm really passionate about this now. So.
Yeah. What specifically about ecotoxicology that you said that we're putting chemicals, and this is so not my lane, so I'm going to butcher it, but we're putting all sorts of compounds and elements that probably shouldn't be in their forms in the ocean. What are some examples? Like, can you talk about that and how you found that out?
Well, for us, we did a lot of stuff as an undergrad. I did a lot of stuff with heavy metals. So copper, specifically because Florida has a huge agricultural industry and copper is used a lot in pesticides, fertilizers, herbicides, fungicides.
Really?
Yeah. So I didn't know that either, but we have all these metals that, we're putting out into the environment. And the issue with heavy metals is that they don't biodegrade over time. So they just continue accumulating in the environment. So, the EPA has put out regulations saying this much amount of metal is, allowed to be used, but then it's never breaking down. So we're just continuously adding and adding on top of it. So it's never going to be at that threshold that they said. It's just going to continue growing, which to me was super scary, but fascinating.
Yeah.
Especially since I choose to sort of focus on sublethal effects. So I'm not looking at the dosages that will outright kill an animal. I'm looking at what's happening before it dies. Because even if these animals aren't dying because the concentration is so high, their behavior is still being affected. And if they can't, forage for food, if they can't find mates, if they can't seek shelter, if they can't perceive danger, those populations are still going to decline. So that's what I found interesting. But I mean, I still love my heavy metals, don't get me wrong, but I mean, there's just so much emerging contaminants that, are coming out recently to be an issue. There's something called PFAS. They're per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which sounds super scary.
Wait, say that one more time.
Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. PFAS for short. But it's basically just a substance that we use in like fire retardants. We used it in Teflon pans back in the days.
Yeah.
So we started using these compounds back in the 1940s, but it's only now that we're starting to see the significant effect that it's having not only on the environment, but on people. It's super understudied. We still don't know what it, what the greater consequences for this are, but, certain studies have linked it, in human health, like health hazards, leading to cancer and other diseases. So it's very interesting to see what we put out 60 years ago, 70 years ago is now coming back to bite us in the ass, basically.
Yeah. That's terrifying. I mean, so much in biology and conservation realm.
I mean, even something that most people don't think about, one big thing that's sort of popping up more and more all over the place is pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals that are not uptaken by the body, so we get rid of them, or pharmaceuticals that are flushed down the toilet. There's been studies done with, fish that have been tested, and there's heart medication in there, and there's cholesterol medication in these fish, and antidepressants.
Yep.
And I was like, great.
Well, at least our fish aren't depressed.
Yeah, but I think they're having other issues.
They're having a lot of other issues. Oh gosh. Well, would you, okay, two-part question. Would you say ecotoxicology is a field of study that you would encourage maybe early career conservationists to get into? And if so, why?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, here's like for me now, I'm trying to look at how climate change and chemical pollution are working synergistically to affect our aquatic habitats.
Wow.
And I mean, climate change, don't get me wrong, and I'm going to get a lot of hate from people because obviously climate change is a big thing, but there's a lot of people working on it. There's not a lot of people working on chemical pollution. There's not a lot of people working on, biological and physical pollution. Everybody always thinks, well, we need to get rid of plastic because, we see plastic, we see marine debris, but we don't see the chemicals, and we don't sort of see those hidden contaminants that are not physically there. So it's, I think, a field that is very underappreciated and underrepresented. And it's definitely something that I think people need to keep a bigger eye on, because these contaminants have the potential to cause a lot of damage, and they'll cause the damage before we even realize it's happening. So by the time we get to that point, we're going to be trying to backpedal and trying to figure out how to fix the mess we started. But if we had more people working on it, we could sort of prevent it from happening before it even gets that far, I think.
Yeah. Do you see hope? That was my second question. Do you see hope with things turning around?
I mean, I don't want to be gloom and doom.
I know.
It's so hard because I'm like, I don't want to be like the person that says, nope, we're all screwed. We waited too long, it went too far. So I do want to say that there's hope. I think a big part of it is just getting people involved and getting people, to acknowledge that we have an issue. Last year, we had a massive fish kill in Biscayne Bay. Thousands of fish just floated up dead one night. And, it was horrible. It was tragic, but it sort of sparked this interest within, the community around Biscayne Bay to, go to the politicians and ask, for changes to be made on septic tanks, and, asked for better infrastructure. And it sort of rallied the people. And I think that's what we need. We need the people, like the everyday person, to care, and the everyday person to rally to make like a big change.
Yes. I love that. We need the everyday people. That's good. So talk a little bit about how, when you said at the very beginning, how when you're doing your work, when you're out there diving, snorkeling, you encounter people all the time who are interested in what you're doing. How do you interact with them? What does that look like? Because if we need the everyday person, this could be a way to get that everyday person, is to have them join you on these trips, on these research expeditions or
right
studies.
I mean, it really depends on what it is that's happening. We've done like little workshops at dive shops to talk a little bit about coral health and how to identify coral diseases and coral bleaching, and how to report that to the Florida CFAN program, which monitors coral health here in South Florida. So getting out there and, talking to people who are constantly on the ground is a great way to do it. I mean, it's something that I want to implement for my graduate studies, because we can't always be out there, but divers are always going to be out there, and divers mostly care. I mean, you have one or two, bad apples in the whole thing, but divers mostly care about the ocean. So it's great to get them involved. Every day we have something called king tide, and that's just like the highest tide that we have here in Florida. And it happens 3 or 4 times a year. And every time it happens, the streets flood, even though there's not a single cloud in the sky. It's just coming up from the sewage, it's coming up from the ground. And last time we went out, we were out taking water samples to test, for bacteria and other nasty things that are floating around in this water that people are just stepping through. And like 4 or 5 people came up to us and they're like, hey, what are you guys doing? We're like, oh, we're taking water samples. And, they told us the story about how they've lived here for 20 years and 20 years, they've been in the same house and they've never had a flooding issue. And now all of a sudden the whole street gets flooded, 4 or 5 times a year and they don't know why. And, we explained it to them. They're like, well, I had no idea that this is why my houses and my streets were flooding. Or, we had a fisherman who was there and he was telling us, about how he catches different fish when there's king tide and how he never know why, but it was so cool. And he loved coming out to fish, but the park where he fished is now underwater. So he has to come up with waiters, So it's always fun to hear everybody's story because I think everybody has their own perspective. And I think once they understand why things are happening and what they can do to change that, is sort of where we're going to get that push for people caring about the environment.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be relatable to them, I think.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, even the way you told that story of people coming up to you, they're asking what you're doing, but in the reality, they want to talk about what they've experienced. Right. Like they're interested, sure. But really, they want to talk about, well, here's my experience. Here's what I've witnessed over the past 20, 30, 40 years in the area.
Right. And to me, that information is just invaluable. I mean, for scientists, we come and go, basically, especially as a scientist, you're not always going to be in the same region constantly. But these are people who, they've been here for generations, their grandparents bought that house. They've lived in that house, like they've been in the area. They've been in the neighborhoods before, it was a huge metropolitan area and it was a huge city, and those are the stories that I think are just fascinating. And those are the voices that I feel like need to be amplified because they know what it was like back then. We're just working off of data. We know data-wise what this looked like back then as scientists, but they're the people that actually were physically there.
Yeah, and their stories are valuable.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. I want to go back to your early life when you lived in the Dominican Republic and then in Germany. What got you interested in conservation science, in the ocean? I mean, you kind of hinted at it in the constants of the sea and the sky. Can you go more in depth about that and how you were drawn to this field?
I mean, I think I was always meant to be an ocean baby. My father was a scuba instructor and my mother worked at the scuba shop. That's where they met in Dominican Republic at a hotel. So that's kind of how they met. My grandfather on both sides of my family were fishermen.
Okay.
So in Dominican Republic, I would go out with my grandfather in Dominican Republic, when he would go fishing. And when I went to Germany, we lived in a small town up north near the North Sea. And, my grandfather was a fisherman and then he would take me out to go fishing. And I would love to go out during, high tides and low tides. And I would walk around and I would find like little jellyfish laying on the floor. And, I tried to take him home and I didn't understand. I couldn't just keep him in a bucket of fresh water. And I was like, well, my jellyfish died. And my grandmother was like, well, duh. And, I was like, well, now I want to understand why my jellyfish died because I put it in water and it was clean water. This is like back when I was 8 years old and I went and told my parents, I'm going to be a marine biologist. And they're like, that's nice, dear. That's beautiful. And, I think they kind of thought I would grow out of it. And here I am like 20 years later. I'm like, yep, still doing it.
Yeah.
So my family and, and my culture and what I was surrounded by very much so influenced what I wanted to do.
And I love that interest in learning about species, like putting the jellyfish in water. You're like, this makes total sense to me why this would survive, but yet it's not. So how can that spark of interest being around the water all the time?
Yeah, that was traumatizing to me as a child. I would try again and again. And after like the 4th time, I was like, my grandpa's like, all right, you need to stop. I was like, but why are you dying? He's like, cause it's fresh water. I mean, now I understand tap water is entirely different than fresh water, which is entirely different than salt water. But, as a kid, that's very confusing. And I was like, I'm going to get to the bottom of this as to why this is happening because I will not stand for it. I want to pet jellyfish.
It's your first scientific experiment. You made an observation. You had a hypothesis: the jellyfish will survive in this bucket of water. It did not. You conducted an experiment, and then you revised, and that's the beginnings of an early scientist. That's so cool. So you were saying you did a whole bunch of different field jobs and have traveled doing all sorts of things. You worked in the mangroves. You said you were on a helicopter. What type of jobs did you have that led you to the career path that you are now? So were you working seasonal, temporary field jobs? Was this all in bachelor's, master's?
No, this was all within my bachelor's. So within marine science, I say a lot of it is in who you know and who likes you.
Yeah.
So networking is extremely important. Ironically enough, I've always had the same job. I've always been, I've been in the same lab. It's always been the same lab, the same job.
What do you mean? It's always been the same lab, same job since?
I've always been in the same lab. I've been in the same lab since I started at FIU. I never left that lab. That lab back then was the Ecotoxicology and Risk Assessment Lab. Now it's the Coastal Conservation and Restoration Lab because somebody new took over. But technically, physically speaking, I've always been in the same lab. Yeah. It's just people would ask me like, hey, can you come help me with this? Or are you interested in working on this project? Because I'd love to get your perspective. And that's how I sort of managed to branch out a lot. And to do different things, even though it wasn't necessarily my core project, I was involved in other people's projects. And that's sort of how I got to dip my toes into other people's work as well.
Got it. You're right. It is about who you know. And, as a biologist myself in Tennessee, I have limited resources to travel and do some of the things that I would love to do with other biologists in Florida or across the globe or something like that. Like, it's important to do and volunteer and work with the biologists where you are, but yet I also do want to do coral reef restoration with you guys. Like, I'm gonna have to plan a trip down there to help that out because that sounds awesome.
We're working on setting up some coral reefs, of outplanting some corals, so that should be fun.
Oh wow.
Yeah. We're going to try to build a reef and see if we can maintain it.
Wow.
But I mean, it's, I always tell people, don't shoot down an opportunity just because you might not think it's exactly what you want to do.
Yeah.
Because you never know. I've been fortunate enough that I've had a great support system, in terms of my advisors. My advisors, I was very loyal to them and they were very loyal to me, which is something that I very much so appreciated, because they have helped me a tremendous amount. And I mean, back then when I first started, I probably thought what I wanted to study was something completely different. I mean, I was never an aquatic toxicologist or contaminant person. To be honest with you, I was never really a coral reef person.
Yeah.
It was just never like one of those things where I'm like, yeah. And now I'm kind of just like, all right, I'll do some coral stuff. That sounds cool. Because to me, it's more about the question. My question has always been the same, like, what are we doing as society? What are we putting out into the ocean? How is this affecting the ocean? And what is that going to mean for us at the end? It's never necessarily been about a specific ecosystem or for a specific organism. It's just, how are we influencing it and how is it going to influence us? And that just so happens to be something that you can do anywhere. You find yourself in a lot of weird little places like, okay, well, this is something, like I did some Arctic stuff and I was like, that couldn't be further away from what I do. And I was like, but this is cool because, people don't really think about the Arctic when they think about, like what we're doing, like chemical wise and pollution wise. And there's a bunch of trash there that has just traveled there via ocean that shouldn't be there. So, it's always very interesting. I tell people, like, especially younger people who are starting out, don't try to like do something because you think it'd be cool to like work with sharks or work with dolphins. Like, that's not what makes a good scientist. It's asking a question and trying to figure out, the answer to this question versus just, well, I don't know what I want to do, but I want to work with sharks. It rarely works out.
Or you get a job like, SeaWorld or something, doing aquaculture, taking care of sharks or something like that. So
But even that's super hard. I feel like people think
Yeah.
it's super easy to get
That's
like
true.
an
Yeah.
aquarium job to like take care of animals. Like it's not that easy.
It's not. And people hold on to those jobs too. Like
Yeah.
if you get a job working in an aquarium, even the local aquarium here, people would cling on to those jobs because they know how valuable it is to have a position at an aquarium.
Right.
So do you think, with regards to science and encouraging people to be in the sciences, do you think there's enough funding for the projects that can answer all those questions you have? What are we putting in the oceans? What are we doing as humans? Those are such great questions, but how can we improve the funding?
I mean, I'm biased, so I'm going to say that the funding is always limited. We always need more funding. But I think an important thing is to sort of branch out and how you go about acquiring funding.
Okay.
I'm in a very specific position because I do, some aquatic toxicology work. I technically can sort of link that back to human health. So I have a couple different places to pull funding from. And even then, it's extremely difficult for me to get funding. You just, an important thing, and my number one tip for people is when you're trying to have someone on your side that knows how to go about doing this.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I was flying solo, it was a lot more difficult than when I had a support system to help me navigate it. Because a lot of it is also just bureaucracy and how you word specific things.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily, that your proposal was bad or that your funding idea was bad. It's just that you may not have worded it in the right way. And that caused them to be like, well, we're not really sure about this. I have, there's a professor at my university that I really want to work with also. And she's a chemist and she does contamination stuff. And she put in a proposal and her proposal was denied. And she did not change anything on the proposal other than she changed the name of a specific compound and labeled it as an endocrine disruptor. And all of a sudden they were like, yep, we need that. And she's like, it was the same proposal. I just changed, the name of the compound to endocrine disruptor. And then all of a sudden people were like, yep, we need to study this. And then they funded it the second time around, but it was the same thing.
Wow. So having really strong connections with the advisors, professors, people who have experience getting that funding, those funding streams, grant writers, peer-reviewed publications, everyone, and being on, like, kind of offering to help them get funding and learn from them.
Right.
Is that your tip, essentially?
Yeah. Yes. And there's also, which is something that's great that I've seen happening a lot more recently, is people sort of going down the startup and nonprofit route. Because they're not necessarily getting governmental funding. There's this great collective here in Florida called Seaworthy Collective, and they go out to these major companies and they get sponsors.
Oh.
And those sponsors are funding research that is going to go towards, making South Florida a blue and green economy, which I think is great. So there's sort of different avenues recently popping up, which I love, because it's great to get different perspectives. It's great to get perspectives from people in industry, from startups, from academia, because at the end, that's what we need for the whole picture. Academics are just focused on the academics.
Right.
But, these nonprofit organizations and these startup organizations, they're out there trying to actually come about with something that they can implement to make profit.
Right.
So it's very interesting to see all of these things working together. And I'm hoping that Florida, within the next couple of years, we can sort of take the reins and start leading that a little bit, because there isn't a lot of collaboration between academia, industry, and sort of this now niche, like blue economy startup world that's popping up more everywhere.
Talk more about that, the blue economy. What do you mean by blue economy?
Well, essentially what they're trying to do is build these startups that, are environmentally friendly and are specifically there to do research that's supposed to benefit the environment. And, as much as, yes, they're environmentalists, they're also companies, they're businesses. They're trying to figure out something that is environmentally friendly, but can make a profit, which I know here, in the conservation world, we always tend to sort of frown upon that. Like, no, you can't make a profit. And I was like, but why not? If you can make a profit, other people are willing to invest in it, which just means you get more funding to continue doing something good while making a profit. It's a win-win-win.
I am so glad you're saying this because like I I have been struggling in my head because we're trying to do something like that through Nova Conservation. And I just keep going back and forth. Should I be a nonprofit or should I be a for-profit? But what will people think about for-profits and da 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 da? And I'm like, listen, conservation needs funds no matter what. And we cannot keep relying on grants and fundraisers.
No, and I feel like a lot of conservationists sort of want to be like martyrs and be like, well, I'm poor and I'm doing it for the love of it. And I was like, okay, well, that's fine. But, you know, you don't have to be poor, you know, like I'm not trying to be poor forever. I would like to at least live comfortably, you know. Like there's no shame in it, and I feel like there's a very big stigma in the conservation field where they're like, if you're making money, you're not doing it for the right reasons. And I was like, but you need money to do the research anyways. Does it matter whether you're getting the money from sponsors who want to see a profit or whether you're getting the money from the government who wants to see results?
Right. Right.
The action is the same. It's just the motivation that's quote unquote different.
Gosh, I am so glad to hear you say that. I am scared of money, to be honest with you, because of that stigma associated with it.
I am
good.
Not scared of money. I would like some money. Like sitting there like, can I have some money, please?
Oh my God.
If you guys like, you know, like all of the people who want to be poor conservationists, kudos to you. I'll be over here trying to make some money.
Right. And that is so great. That's more than great, especially because I can tell your heart and I know my heart too. Like I'm fearful of what other people think, blah, 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 but I know my heart. And I know if I made money through Nova Conservation, it would go to the right funding sources. And I know you make money. It's not going to be like you're buying Mercedes and, you know,
I just want a greenhouse, to be honest.
Yeah, like it's simple things. Like we're not asking for $1 billion here.
I'm from Dominican Republic. Dominican Republic makes a lot of its money from the tourism industry. Yeah. The tourism industry is dependent on having a healthy ecosystem. So technically speaking, Dominican Republic wants to save the environment, not because, you know, they don't love the environment, but because, you know, that's their livelihood. So are you saying that Dominican Republic or, you know, island nations are wrong for wanting to keep the environment, you know, healthy and thriving because it brings them in revenue? I think it's very easy for people who are on the outside looking and saying, I'm doing this for the money and I'm doing this, you know, to be purely altruistic versus saying like, hey, these island nations are dependent on it because they want money. But to be truthful, I don't know how many, you know, Dominicans truly care about coral reefs because they're just a beautiful ecosystem, but they know it feeds their families. So that's what motivates them to want to protect it. Is that really so wrong?
No. And man, I had a train of thought going, but I kind of just want to like hear you talk. Like I had an idea and I just want to keep hearing you talk about this because this is so good. Because tourism, I lost my train of thought. Keep talking. So when you go to the Dominican, people pay to, is it just like snorkel trips or is it research focused trips?
I mean, it's both. I've seen people go to Dominican Republic for research. It gets a little tricky in my experience because there are people in Dominican Republic who would probably love to study marine science. And then there's people coming from outside and then doing like these giant trips over there, but then they're not supporting the local economy, which is what sort of grinds my gear a little bit.
Yes.
I've seen people very close to my hometown. They have, you know, this like nonprofit, like teaching organization where they fly people out and it costs like $5,000 to go there for 10 days. And I'm like, that's nice, but where are the locals? Like, why do you not have local people working for you here? Why are you not, you know, using that money to train some of the local people who are probably at universities who would love to do this to sort of, you know, be your foot on the ground? And that's where my biggest issue comes from. It's when people come from outside into these island nations and, you know, they want to do all this stuff. And I'm not saying don't do it, but include the locals. Don't just shut out the people. You can leave tomorrow. Those people are still going to be here. So you might as well train the people on the ground to actually do some meaningful work.
Yeah, that is a huge pet peeve of mine, is this colonization approach, or the white Western approach, where someone comes in and they run this organization and they do nothing to give back and contribute to local economies and culture and the research, even conservationists and early career, like biologists who want to get experience in the scientific communities in the Dominican Republic, say. So if they cannot get trained to work in science, then we're missing this core demographic of people to be in the sciences, that know the culture, that know the ecology closest. We don't just need more Westerners to come in, do the parachute science, and then leave.
Right.
We need
a
to
lot
train
more
up.
collaboration.
Yeah.
Especially considering the fact, I mean, people always ask, like, why do you think biodiversity is important? Yes. They're like, why do you think diversity is important within STEM, and I always hear, whenever people get asked this question, I always hear, well, it's an important thing to have, everything should be diverse. And I think what people don't focus on is, we don't just need diversity for diversity's sake. We need diversity for perspective's sake. And everybody has a different perspective. You and I, for example, we might look at a problem in completely different ways, and none of those ways are wrong. We're just looking at two sides of a coin, and that's what we need more of in science, because a lot of scientists, especially the older generation, they're very headstrong, and they're like, well, it's my way or the highway. Like, I'm doing it right and everybody else is doing it wrong. But they're missing all of the perspectives from people who just view things differently.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. That's just awesome. Like, I just want to shut up and let you keep talking. This is so good. What do you think of ecotourism in general? So not just Dominican, but other places, other research idea trips. How can ecotourism be most effective in A, gaining funds for conservation, and then B, bringing those funds back to support local economies, support true research initiatives? What are your thoughts on that? How can we make ecotourism be better?
When done right, I think it's a great thing. So here's my thing, which goes back to there's always going to be, wealthy people who, want to go on a trip or want to pretend like they're doing something nice. Take their money. If they want to give it, take the money. Because all that's enabling you to do is, like, A, they get to go out and learn about an ecosystem, or, learn about some sort of conservation. That's great. They're going to be more motivated by it. And then you can use that money to train the people, train the young students, train the locals, train, especially like young scientists and people who need experience, who can't otherwise afford to get it. You take that, it's a little bit of a Robin Hood scheme. You take the money from the rich, and then you distribute it to the people who actually need it. But those are going to be the people that are going to make it possible to even do this, because then they're going to, go out and teach other people about, these ecosystems and sort of lead the way on the ground, which I think is a beautiful thing.
I love that. I fully support that. How do we prevent, though, exploitation of, like, the organization you were talking about, which you didn't name, which is good, because we don't want to, like, call them out, but also be careful that it's not just that we're giving money to a certain demographic, but we're actually giving funds and support to the organizations that charge these trips, but are contributing it back. Like, how do we make sure that that message is clearly communicated? Because that's what I'm trying to figure out with NOVA.
I think the big thing is just transparency. For this organization, it was very clear. Like, if you looked at, I was there on the ground and I just heard about it. So I, basically just went there.
Yeah.
But, like, even if you look online, like, you look at the people who are working for it, you look at the people who, they've trained, and they all look the same. In my opinion, that's a red flag. you know, because then you have other organizations who do it very well. And then, you know, you see that, you just see from their social media presence or from their web presence that there is a lot of collaboration there. And I think that's what we need a lot more of, you know. Yeah, I do some work with, you know, Sharks for Kids, Shark Education, and it's great because a lot of the stuff that they do actually gets used in Bahamian classrooms to teach the children about, you know, sharks and ocean conservation. And I think that's what we need to see a lot more. We need to see these organizations actually giving that knowledge back to the people whose land they're basically on. I think that's a very important thing. And it's just transparency is key to that. You know, when I see an organization being like really sketchy and not wanting to put out a lot, I'm like, what's going on in the background there? Because if you're doing things right, you should be proud of doing things right. You know, I would be proud. Like, you know, now I'm doing a lot of stuff in the Caribbean and I'm hoping to be able to, you know, have different partners within the Caribbean. I was like, that's going to be really cool for me to be like, yeah, I'm working with this person over here and this person over here. And, you know, these people are going to help me collect data and I'm going to help collect data for these. Like, it's a beautiful thing when things work in symbiosis. So when people are being sketchy, I'm like, what are you doing wrong? He's like, what's your deal?
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting you say that because like, I'm very proud of partnering with nonprofits and research institutions. But for a time, I put that on the back burner because I was for NOVA, because I was like, well, I want to have an authentic database of reviews of these organizations. So I don't want to associate myself with any organizations because we're doing authentic, transparent reviews of these groups. And that's still on the back burner because of development.
Hasn't everything been on the back burner in this past year? Someone asked me like, hey, can you send me like an updated email of like your accomplishments in the last year? And I was like, I'm alive. That's what I've accomplished. Like, I'm still alive. That's my accomplishment for the year.
Oh, that's so funny. Yeah. My kids are alive. I'm alive. That's how I feel.
That's all that counts right now. It's like, I have no energy for anything else. But, you know, a lot of things are in the back burner, and I think that's okay. I think as people, we need to forgive ourselves a little bit if we haven't been as productive in the last year.
Yep, that's something I'm learning. Just how to be very kind to myself. Because I have a very mean inner critic, I've learned. So she is a little bitch and I'm shutting her down. So with your specific work, well, first of all, what are you doing for your PhD project? Again, like specifically going out and
so right now, this is actually what I've been working on for the last week. I've been glued to my computer reading papers. You know, for those that think marine conservation and marine science is just being out in the field. Nope. It's a lot of paper reading.
Yes.
So the general idea for my PhD right now is to sort of understand synergistic effects. So synergistic, for those that don't know what this means or don't have a chemical background, is essentially when two compounds or the sum of two compounds is greater when combined than each individual one.
Yeah.
So I liken this, because I'm an amateur gardener, to like if you have a garden, if you have a pesticide and a fertilizer, chances are if you use both a pesticide and a fertilizer on your garden, unless you're a total crap gardener, chances are that these two things combined will have a greater effect on your garden being healthier. Now, we have this thing, unfortunately for us, it's the opposite within conservation, because you could have two compounds, for example, that individually would be bad enough. For example, global warming, or climate change, and, you know, ocean acidification as one thing, and then a pollutant. It could be that these two things working together are basically just creating a perfect storm. So if you had one or the other, it would be bad, but by combining them, the effect is greater. So I'm trying to see how climate change and chemical pollution is sort of working together and what that means for our ecosystems. Because a lot of the times, you know, we'll focus on one thing, but the truth is out there, it's not just one thing happening, you know, so it's never really the full picture when you just study one thing that's affecting the environment. We've got so many different pieces constantly moving at the same time.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out how these things are working together to affect our coral reef ecosystems, down from the actual health of the corals to, populations and communities and the trophic structures. So it's really trying to get a broad picture of what climate change and chemical pollution is doing to our coastal ecosystems.
That's a lot. That's pretty
Which
heavy.
is a lot. And everybody, they're like, you need to rein it in. And I was like, I don't know how.
How do I focus on just one thing? I
was like, I can't.
Do you foresee, getting back to like the ecotourism piece and the collaborative efforts, do you foresee a way that your field work could bring people out and help raise funds for this type of research while doing a tourism impact?
So I actually am. Part of it, a very big part of what we're going to do is going to be looking at coral reef ecosystems that are sort of in these hot zones for pollution. We've identified certain areas where we're like, there's major point sources of pollution here.
Yeah. It's
coastal. So we know that, climate change is happening around here, and then trying to go out to corals that are a little bit further out or that are, in marine protected areas that are perfectly healthy. So I actually do want to involve a lot of citizen science initiatives in this, by having people, through local dive shops come out to these reefs and survey them for us, take pictures, survey, submit them to us. And it's great because there gets to be money made through it. But B, you're also going out and, teaching people like, this is what an unhealthy reef like. This is what a healthy reef looks like and should look like. In South Florida, we have a lot of reefs that are dead and people will go out diving, or people that don't know what these reefs look like 10, 15 years ago are like, oh, well, it's a great reef. And then, you've got the veterans and like, I was diving here 20 years ago and this looks dead compared to back then. And you're just like, oh, okay. Yeah. Wow. So it is something that I really want to include in my research, just because I feel like once you get people to actually see what it should look like versus what it looks like now because of our impact, I think that's a very big thing. I remember the very first time, when I started diving, I'd seen a whole bunch of dead reefs or reefs that were half dead. But, like, to me, the ocean's the oceans. I was like, it's still a reef, even though it's dead. And then I saw a healthy reef and I was like, what the hell have I been looking at this whole time? I was like, what was that crap that I've been looking at this whole time? So, it's going to be like one of those things, like when you do a 2-tank dive where your first dive will be at an unhealthy reef and then your second dive will be at a healthy reef. And I think that's a great way to sort of get people to appreciate it a little bit more and to get them to, like take these pictures and write up these reports. I think, it gives people a sense of accomplishment when they get to do something like that. At least for me, it does. So,
yeah. And that's what we're trying to do through NOVA, is to bring in funds through putting together trips that can take people out with real researchers and do this hands on the ground experience, get funds for that, for conservation. And then we're teaching people exactly through this, and then they can go back to their homes and their towns if they're from out of town and do more conservation efforts back at home. And then the funds can be used for conservation research and helping diversity and local people and all of those just like awesome things that
I don't think it's a bad thing. And I mean, it's not even just like the super rich people that want to do it. I know people who are just, day-to-day average Joe people, and they love, the chance to get out there and actually just see a little bit about what's happening and, what they can do to help. And I think it's a beautiful thing. It builds a sense of community,
Yeah. I mean, I am that demographic. I'm not super rich, but I want to go like see other biologists and see what they're doing and see that hands-on work. And if you're going to go on vacation anyway, might as well make it a give back trip.
Right. Might as well get something out of the trip. And I mean, obviously for me, it's a little bit different. I'm like a huge nerd. I'm going on vacation now, and we're going whale watching, and I'm going to like a fossil place, and I'm just like, yeah, fossils. Everybody's like, are you going on vacation? It's like, yeah, we're gonna go hiking and digging through the mud to look for fossils. That's super cool. So for me, it's like, yeah, I want to do this stuff anyways. But I think a lot of people have the ocean is relatable to a lot of people. It's one of those things that as scientists, we are extremely fortunate because it's something that's just super relatable. There's some people who work on, I don't know. I don't even want to say cell research or something, because that's something, but
you can't see a cell like you can
see. Yeah. Or, people who are studying something like super obscure, and people are like, okay, cool. Like, I mean, I think all sciences are awesome, so don't come for me. But, it's like, I feel like the ocean is something that to most people is relatable. So, we're in a very unique position where we can make people care about the ocean. You just have to bring it back to why it matters to them. And somebody's like, well, why should I care about the ocean? They're like, well, do you like your sushi? And they're like, you're not going to have any more sushi if, we deplete all of our fisheries. And it's all of a sudden like, oh, okay. Or, do you like having things shipped from across the world? It comes on a cargo boat. Without a healthy ocean, that cargo boat is not going to be able to deliver your things. Yeah. It's sort of, do you like living in a place that has a decent economy? Without tourism, that's going to go down the shitter. So, it's really just bringing it back and making people care for it. And once you find that one specific thing that they care about, then all of a sudden it sparks their interest. Like, oh, okay. You're right. We should be conserving this. I do not want to change my lifestyle. So.
It's all interconnected. All interconnected. Sometimes I go through my day like thinking about how people who are in, like just business or office jobs or do like design work or graphic design, right. And they don't think about the environment in their everyday day-to-day life. And I'm like, that is such a loss, because we need to be thinking about this every day. I think about it every day, how all the impacts will have these effects on our lifestyle and our health, and impact the third world countries the most, poor people the most, especially the impacts of climate change, where people who haven't been contributing at all to climate change, countries who haven't been contributing to man-made climate change will be the most impacted. And like we just sit in I come from a privileged background, we just sit here like, I'm just going to do my thing and go to the grocery store and not think about it, but we need to be thinking about it.
I mean, to me, it's very interesting. We just had this discussion on social media the other day about whether climate change is a social justice issue or not. And someone said, well, I don't think it's a social justice issue. I think it's just an issue in general. And by trying to label it as one thing, you're downplaying it. And I was like, well, it's not necessarily downplaying it. It is a social justice issue. And, I feel like it's very easy for people to say that it's not a social justice issue unless you've been there. And you've seen it. So some of my friends live up in the Canadian Arctic. They're Inuit. They're indigenous to the Arctic. They are fascinating to me because their global footprint, like I'm pretty sure they're like in the negatives for their global footprint. Like they still go out and hunt, They live in very small, close-knit, tight communities, but they're the ones being affected the most by climate change. The first thing to go is the sea ice. And that sea ice, that is something that, they've been leading it, like this is their traditional knowledge. They go back generations. They pass down knowledge, from generation to generation. And because of climate change, what they know about their own ecosystems that has been passed down by their ancestors is suddenly changing. Like, but they contribute the least amount to it. So, Dominican Republic gets flooded every time there's a hurricane, and I think it's very easy to say it's not a social justice issue until it's you or your family that's on the roof of your house because the streets are flooded.
Bingo.
It's very easy to sort of try to dismiss, well, it's just a general issue. It's not a social justice issue, but it kind of is a social justice issue, because usually the people that are so poor that they're being affected by it, that they can't do anything to change it, don't have the means to contribute to it in the first place.
Man, yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. This is so good. And I hope that I want to be mindful of time and everything, but I hope that your work and the work we're doing through NOVA can really contribute and help and solve some of these injustices and these systemic problems that I see and that exist, getting more diverse backgrounds in science and ethical ecotourism.
Right. I think it's just a matter of perspective, and that's what a lot of people seem to miss. Because it's not even like I'm saying, like, you know, like, well, let's flip the script and say, you know, like in Dominican Republic, nobody should ever come from the outside. It's great to have a diverse team because everybody brings in their unique and different perspectives through their different experiences. I'm not saying like, no, don't do this, or no, don't. Like, I'm saying you actually need a diverse team. And I mean that from every possible angle, you know. I'm not saying don't include the white man. Maybe the white man has a different perspective than I have, you know, because his experiences are different. It's just about bringing everybody into the room who needs to be in that room.
Preach. Yeah. We need to hear from as many diverse perspectives as possible when it comes to stuff
and
like
that's
this.
the only way, in my opinion, that we're actually going to get a handle on things before it gets to the point where it's too late, and then it will truly be gloom and doom.
Yeah, we're not there yet. There's still hope.
We still got time. We just got to make the effort now.
Yes, we need to hear from the Inuits. We need to hear from the locals. We need to hear their perspectives, their input, their backgrounds, their knowledge. It's so important and it's so vital.
I mean, in the Arctic, there was a perfect example of it because of the fact that there was an ecotourism station there.
Oh, really?
Yes, but it was on land that Indigenous people could not visit because they just didn't have the means to go. Because you need like a small plane to go. But then when you looked at everybody who worked for it, there was no Indigenous people. I was like, how are you going to come to this land as an outsider that you know nothing about because you did not grow up here and you do not possess that traditional knowledge? Because it's not like, you know, something as easy as saying, well, I moved to this island, you know, my great grandparents moved to this island. Like, no. And then try to teach other people about it in a very bad way, in my opinion, because it wasn't even ethical ecotourism. They were being very disruptive of local wildlife, which in my opinion was, you know, a no-go.
Yeah, no.
And then not have any Indigenous people there, but, you know, like a trip out there was like $5,000 for like 3 nights, you know? So like, really, you had a chance to do something good and you just shot yourself in the foot with it. So,
and that's what we're trying, like, there's so much exploitation in the industry, whether it's for people who want to be the ecotourism tour guides or biologists or what have you, that anyone's willing to jump in and work for free and kind of overlook all the other systemic problems. So to do this right, it's going to take careful planning, consideration from all perspectives. That's why I'm having these conversations, to get as much diverse input as possible and the nuance of how what traps to not fall into that other organizations have maybe fallen into.
Right.
Yeah. So it's a lot of work. It is a lot of work. And I also don't, because I've talked to some, you know, I've talked to people and they're like, well, make sure you do this, make sure you do this. And I'm like, I am one person right now. We are all doing the best we can, given the means and resources we have at our disposal. And I'm hoping that the organizations that you've been referring to, like, had the best of intentions, maybe need tweaking, but that's why I'm like, there's room for growth. We don't want to call out people. We don't want to like shame people. We don't want to, I'm trying not to like just blatantly blast people. Oh, they did this wrong. Maybe it's a step in the right direction. And if they knew, or if they were more educated and had the resources to hear from the local people, the Indigenous people, and be like, hey, we can't do this, or I don't know, whatever, there might be room for growth.
Right.
I hope so. I hope people who are in this ecotourism, ethical ecotourism, want to grow. Now, I know there's definitely organizations who are just all about the money, and yeah, that's not cool. So
no,
we have to be careful. It does take research, and it takes transparency, and it takes discernment.
Right. But I feel like when you actually find that balance of everything, it's just like such a great tool for conservation.
Thank you. Yeah, I think so too. I think so too. And I'm banking on that there is a market out there. Like conservation kind of needs to have that marketing to be the right way. And I'm not a marketer person, but I'm thinking about how we can tap into the people who really truly do care and will want to give those funds back to.
Right.
Like they can see where their funds are going to, whether it's research, the research benefit for like tangible gear on the ground, or local communities to hire to help with the ethical ecotourism or biological technician work, or like subsidies for diversity in the scientific integrity of a project to help people who are not privileged get a foot in the door. And get papers and peer review and science, and if that's what you're passionate about and you have a need and you have scientific inquiry and want to do that work, there's a way that we can subsidize that. But it's all a process. So yeah, it's a work in progress. What maybe we can talk more, but I do want to be respectful of time, and I know you said you had an appointment to go to in a little bit. So Rose, is there anything final that you would like to say, add, edit, that you didn't get to talk about as much as you would have liked to? What are your final thoughts and contributions to this? I mean, you've done so much that I'm like, we could end it here and it'd be great. Anything final?
I think it's just, especially for younger people, it's to sort of try to keep an open mind and you know, to go into this field with a sort of sense of wonder, because that's what it's all about. It's, you know, we joke, like we, you know, joked earlier, and it's like, you know, I want to make money. Like the truth is we're probably not doing this to become millionaires, but it's a rewarding field in and of itself. And it's just sort of keep an open mind and try to travel, you know, go through your path with that. And don't try to, you know, limit yourself. Like marine conservation or conservation in general is just such a broad field, and what might work for me might not work for somebody else, or vice versa. So it's like, don't like force yourself to try to follow a path that's been laid by somebody else, because maybe that's just not the way it was meant to be, but you'll find your own way of doing things and it might be better for you. So
that's beautiful. Listen to your heart, listen to your intuition, trust yourself. That's something I am trying to listen to more. Where can people find you on social media? What are your handles, tags, if people want to hang out and talk on the interwebs?
On Instagram, it's psycho, so SCIE.co.
SCIE.co. Okay.
Yeah. On Twitter, it's psycho.rose or psycho-rose. And
wait, I'm just now putting this together, that psycho. Oh my gosh, that's perfect. That is so funny.
Fun playing with that one for a while.
Yeah, that's great. That is so smart.
I also have a website, psycho.net, where I post a lot of infographics and just materials that people can share. So it's great for educational purposes.
That's another thing we didn't even really touch on, is your brilliance in scientific communication. So I appreciate everything you're doing. It's been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you.
I'm glad we finally figured it out.
And for those of you, I met Rose initially because I did like a live stream on Instagram, and I had like a glass of wine, and I was like, well, let's just see how this goes. And because no one really joins my lives, but that's okay. That's just what happened. I'm like, whatever. But Rose joined, and she was talking back and forth with me, and then she like came on the screen, and we just got to meet. It was just so beautifully timed and random, and I'd rather have a live where it's just one person and really connect with them than, you know, have a ton of people and not have much of an impact. So that was a really cool thing to to have. So it was really nice to meet you through Instagram, and yeah, we'll talk more soon. Thank you for your input.
That was good.
Thank you for your hard work in scientific integrity and ecotoxicology. And yeah, there's just so much. I'm sure you're probably feeling underfunded and undervalued as a PhD student, and know that your work is valuable and it is worthwhile, and we see you.
Gotta go tell us, send NSF a video of me crying like in the bathtub, like send me money, please.
My work is important, I promise.
Maybe that'll work.
Well, I don't have money to give right now, but I have encouragement, hope, and hopefully through Nova and some other organizations, maybe we can
I'm
help.
looking forward to seeing how this plays out, because the hopes is to have a lot of citizen science and science communication be an integral part of my work. So fingers crossed that the next 5 years are successful.
Yeah. Well, this won't be the end of our communication. We'll talk soon and maybe plan a trip or something like that.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Rose. It was so good talking with you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.